Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight we're stepping into one of the darkest and most unsettling stories of 19th century America. In Louisiana, 1849, whispers spread of an enslaved girl accused of taking the lives of 22 women, a case buried under fear, racism, and unanswered questions. In 1849 Louisiana, slavery was not just an economic system. It was a structure of absolute control. Enslaved people were legally considered property, not human beings, which meant they had no ability to testify in court, no protection from violence, and no way to challenge accusations made against them. Every aspect of their lives was controlled by slaveholders, from where they lived to how they spoke, worked, or even survived. This imbalance of power created a world where truth was defined by those at the top, not by evidence or justice. For enslaved women, the situation was even more dangerous. They were vulnerable to exploitation, punishment, and suspicion, often blamed for crimes or misfortunes that needed an explanation. If illness struck a household or a woman died suddenly, it was easier for enslavers to accuse someone with no legal standing than to confront poor sanitation, disease, or medical ignorance. An enslaved girl had no defense against rumors of poisoning or murder. Once suspicion took hold, her fate was largely sealed by the word of those who owned her. This power imbalance also shaped how investigations were handled, if they happened at all. Accusations against enslaved people rarely required proof. Fear and prejudice were often enough. Confessions could be forced, stories exaggerated, and guilt assumed without trial. In such a system, the line between fact and fiction disappeared quickly. The accusation itself became a weapon, reinforcing control and terror, while ensuring that enslaved individuals remained silent, compliant, and disposable. This imbalance is critical to understanding how a single enslaved girl could be accused of such horrific acts, and why her side of the story may never truly be known. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is that the true identity of the enslaved girl remains unclear and fragmented. Historical records from 1849 rarely preserve the names, ages, or personal histories of enslaved individuals, especially girls. When they were mentioned, it was often only in passing, referred to as a slave, a servant girl, or by a first name with no surname, stripping them of identity and humanity. This makes it difficult to separate who she truly was from what she was accused of being. What little can be pieced together suggests she was young, likely working within domestic spaces such as kitchens, sick rooms, or households where women gathered. These environments placed her close to food, medicine, and caregiving, roles that later fed into suspicions against her. Because enslaved girls were often tasked with preparing meals or tending to the ill, they became convenient scapegoats when someone fell sick or died. Proximity alone was enough to turn routine labor into perceived opportunity for crime. There is also no surviving record of her voice, no written testimony, no personal account, no confirmed confession given freely. Everything known about her comes through the words of slaveholders, newspapers, or later retellings, all shaped by racial fear and power. Over time, her identity blurred into legend, transforming from a real human being into a symbol of menace in local storytelling. Whether she was guilty, falsely accused, or a victim of mass hysteria may never be known. What remains certain is that her story reflects how easily an enslaved girl could lose her name, her truth, and her humanity, while history remembered only the accusation. The accusations against the enslaved girl did not emerge from a single clear event, but rather grew slowly out of fear, coincidence, and rumor. In mid-19th century Louisiana, sudden illness and death, especially among women, were tragically common. Diseases like yellow fever, cholera, and tuberculosis spread rapidly, and medical professionals often lacked the knowledge to identify exact causes. When multiple women fell ill or died within a short period, people searched for explanations that went beyond disease, turning instead to suspicion and blame. Whispers reportedly began within households and plantation communities, where enslaved workers were constantly observed and judged. If the girl had served food, prepared remedies, or cared for sick women, her presence became a point of fixation. Ordinary actions, mixing herbs, handling meals, or following orders, could be reinterpreted as malicious once fear took hold. Each new death strengthened the narrative, even without proof, creating a chain of assumptions rather than evidence. Local gossip and word of mouth played a powerful role. In a time before reliable journalism or formal investigations, stories were repeated, exaggerated, and reshaped as they spread. What may have started as suspicion of poisoning in one case could quickly evolve into claims of multiple murders. Racial stereotypes about enslaved people, especially myths surrounding poison, witchcraft, or secret knowledge, fed directly into these accusations. Authorities and slaveholders were often willing to accept these stories without scrutiny because they aligned with existing fears and reinforced social control. Crucially, there was no clear moment where the accusations were formally tested or proven. Instead, they accumulated like layers of shadow, built on fear rather than facts. By the time the number reached 22 women, the story had taken on a life of its own, less a criminal case and more a reflection of a society desperate for someone to blame. The claim that 22 women lost their lives is one of the most striking and most questionable parts of this story. Historical accounts do not provide a complete list of names, dates, or confirmed causes of death. Instead, the number appears to have grown over time through repetition rather than documentation. In 1849 Louisiana, women's deaths, especially those occurring in domestic settings, were often poorly recorded, leaving large gaps that rumors could easily fill. Most of the alleged victims were said to be women connected to the same households or communities where the enslaved girl worked or was present. This perceived pattern became central to the accusations. If a woman fell ill after eating a meal, drinking tea, or receiving care, the girl's involvement in those routines was retroactively seen as suspicious. Normal domestic duties were reframed as opportunities for harm, even though these were tasks she was forced to perform. What stands out is the lack of medical consistency. Symptoms described in surviving accounts vary widely. Some deaths were sudden, others slow, some accompanied by fever, others by weakness or pain. These differences strongly suggest natural illness rather than a single method of murder. However, at the time, limited medical understanding meant that poisoning was often blamed when symptoms couldn't be explained. The idea of a hidden killer offered a sense of control in a world where disease felt random and unstoppable. As the story spread, the deaths were no longer viewed individually, but as part of a growing narrative. Each new illness reinforced the belief that a pattern existed, even when evidence was absent. The alleged victims became numbers rather than people, used to strengthen the accusation rather than remembered for their lives. This transformation, from tragedy to folly, played a major role in turning fear into legend and suspicion into certainty, without ever proving the truth. Rumors were the driving force behind how this case evolved, spreading faster and more powerfully than facts ever could. In 1849, Louisiana. In tightly knit plantation communities and crowded towns, news traveled by word of mouth, through kitchens, markets, churches, and slave quarters. Once suspicion attached itself to the enslaved girl, every new illness or death was immediately folded into the same story. Fear turned coincidence into confirmation. Mass hysteria thrived in environments where people already felt unsafe. Disease outbreaks, high mortality rates, and limited medical explanations created a constant sense of dread. When people are afraid, they look for patterns, even where none exist. The idea of a single hidden threat, someone close, silent, and unseen, offered an explanation that felt easier to grasp than invisible illness. As a result, logic gave way to emotion, and rumor replaced investigation. Racial prejudice amplified this hysteria. Enslaved people were often portrayed as dangerous, deceptive, or secretly vengeful in popular beliefs of the time. Stories of poisoning enslavers or mistresses were already part of Southern folklore, making the accusation feel believable to many without requiring proof. Each retelling sharpened the story, increasing the number of alleged victims and solidifying the girl's image as a villain rather than a person. Once hysteria takes hold, it becomes self-sustaining. Anyone who questioned the accusations risked being seen as naive or complicit. Silence and agreement became safer than doubt. In this way, rumors didn't just shape public opinion, they became the case itself. Long before evidence could speak, fear had already delivered its verdict. One of the most revealing aspects of this case is how little evidence there is of any proper, formal investigation. In 1849 Louisiana, the justice system was designed to protect property and social order, not to uncover truth, especially when enslaved people were involved. If accusations were made against an enslaved girl, they were often accepted at face value, with no requirement for forensic proof, witness verification, or medical examination. Autopsies were rare, and toxicology as a science was still in its infancy. Many poisons could not be reliably detected, and most deaths were attributed based on visible symptoms or assumptions. Instead of investigating environmental factors like contaminated water, spoiled food, or contagious disease, authorities often focused on assigning blame quickly. An enslaved person provided a convenient answer, one that didn't challenge the authority or responsibility of slaveholders. Records from this period show that interrogations of enslaved individuals were frequently coercive. Confessions, if they occurred, were often extracted under threat or punishment, and then treated as unquestionable truth. Enslaved people were not allowed legal representation, and their testimony carried little weight unless it confirmed what authorities already believed. In many cases, proceedings were informal, undocumented, or handled privately by plantation owners rather than courts. The absence of a structured investigation allowed rumor to stand in for evidence. Once the accusation spread, there was no mechanism to stop it, question it, or verify it. This lack of due process is crucial to understanding why the story became so extreme and why history is left with accusations instead of answers. What remains is not a solved case, but a silence where justice should have been. The line between documented history and folklore is especially blurred in this case. Official records from 1849 Louisiana are sparse, fragmented, and often biased, particularly when they involve enslaved individuals. Court documents, medical reports, and death certificates, if they existed at all, rarely centered enslaved people as subjects worth detailed record keeping. As a result, historians are left with gaps that folklore quickly filled. Newspapers of the era sometimes sensationalized crime, especially stories that fed into existing fears about enslaved people. Headlines and brief mentions could exaggerate claims without follow-up or verification. Over time, these early reports were retold, reprinted, and reshaped, each version drifting further from whatever facts originally existed. What began as rumor hardened into history, simply because it was repeated often enough. Folklore thrives where certainty is absent. In local storytelling, the enslaved girl became less a real person and more a cautionary figure, an embodiment of hidden danger and moral warning. Details changed depending on who told the story, the number of victims grew, motives were invented, and methods became more sinister. These additions made the tale more compelling, but also less truthful. Modern historians face the challenge of separating evidence from narrative. When documents are missing, silence itself becomes meaningful, raising questions about who was allowed to be remembered and who was erased. In this case, folklore preserved the accusation, while history lost the human being behind it. What survives is not a clear record of guilt or innocence, but a reflection of how fear can outlive facts and how stories can replace truth when power controls the archive. The story of the enslaved girl accused of killing 22 women has left a lasting shadow on true crime history, not because it was ever conclusively solved, but because of what it reveals about storytelling, power, and memory. It stands as an early example of how crime narratives can be shaped less by evidence and more by fear, bias, and social inequality. Long before modern media, this case showed how a compelling accusation could become permanent, even without proof. In true crime culture, especially in the 19th century, the focus was often on shock rather than justice. Stories involving enslaved people were frequently stripped of nuance, turning complex human situations into simple tales of evil. This case helped cement a pattern where marginalized individuals were portrayed as villains, while the systems that enabled injustice remained unexamined. The accused became the story, the social conditions disappeared. The legacy also influences how modern audiences consume historical true crime. It reminds us to question sources, ask who controlled the narrative, and consider whose voices were excluded. Many cases involving enslaved or oppressed people survive only as accusations, not investigations. This makes them powerful cautionary tales about how history can mislead when context is ignored. Ultimately, the impact of this story is not about confirming guilt or innocence. It's about understanding how easily truth can be buried under repetition. It challenges true crime storytelling to move beyond sensationalism and toward responsibility, empathy, and critical examination. In doing so, it transforms from a tale of alleged murder into a deeper warning about injustice, memory, and the cost of silence.